We're all looking to contribute to finding solutions and to surfacing ideas that will make that roadmap all the more tangible. And today we're specifically looking at the mining sector and how mining and metal companies can contribute to the circular economy. One of the big questions for the year is how different sectors can incorporate elements of circularity into their respective operations. And I'm happy to welcome today's guests and hear their insights and perspectives. We have with us today Akshay Fofaria, partner at Pinsent Masons, Dr. Claude Kabemba, Executive Director of South Africa Resource Watch, and Viridiana Bello Wheatle, Sustainability Consultant at the Ras Al Khaimah Municipality Department. I'd like to start off by inviting our guests to make some opening statements on this question. And Akshay, let's kick it off with you. Your opening thoughts on the theme of today's podcast.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I mean, this is a really interesting topic, and I think we're in a state of flux at the moment around regulation, and that's the perspective from which I would like to say a few words. And I think if we're looking at mining and circularity, we need to look at it from the perspective of the above ground mine as well as the below ground mine. What do I mean by that? Well, the above ground mine is essentially all the materials that have been mined in the past and which are ripe for recycling. And the West's focus, and I speak because that's where I'm situated, has really been on reducing programmed obsolescence. Your fridge has to last longer, and there are now increasing numbers of penalties in certain states around programmed obsolescence. And more recently, in this year, we have the imminent promulgation of the European battery regulation, which will incentivize, I guess, the recycling of materials and also the use of sustainable materials in the production of batteries. Now, the challenge for the above ground mine is it potentially conflicts with another geopolitical desire on the part of many countries, which is to retain control over critical minerals, which are necessary for core manufacturing in those countries. And unless you have the facilities to significantly recycle products, any regulation which forces you to then recycle will involve the export of critical minerals to countries such as China, which have, hundreds, if not close to 1,000 recycling facilities. So that's, one of the issues around the above ground mine. Now, if we look at the below ground mine, which is the core substance of, I think, of this session, miners have, in more recent years, focused on the processes around mining, for example, ensuring that tailings are used and recycled, which are the waste which ends up out on the top of mine sites, that effluent is properly reused in the mining processes, and on reduction of water usage. And now that's understood, but to some degree, environmental campaigners and others have argued that this is just skating around the surface, and that actually the real conversation should be around a shift in the debate from the processes around mining to the purpose of mining. And there is a question, as we see corporations get closer to states, that corporations that are involved in mining may find themselves with the role of having to police the mining value chain. That is to say, determine what the destination of the minerals are. And that would mean not using minerals for consumer items and things which are easily disposed of, but for their highest use case. And that could be healthcare, it could be renewable energy. And to conclude, from a regulatory perspective, I don't think that's necessarily an enormous leap in what we're used to in terms of regulation. The Kimberley process for tracking blood diamonds and conflict diamonds established regimes which required you to track and trace where the source of diamonds were. We should be able to re-engineer that in reverse so that miners can track and trace the destination. Secondly, the idea that you have to identify responsible actors is not news, particularly in markets in Africa, for example, where we have broad-based economic empowerment, which grades market participants in South Africa. That they may not be ideal in practice, but we have experience of it. And finally, local content. Many countries, particularly in Africa, are used to local content regimes which govern how you procure and from whom you procure. And it's not a huge leap to determine that you can shift from that type of regulation to regulation which determines who you're entitled to sell to. So that, in a nutshell, is sort of my perspective on the topic, Thomas.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and thank you for those opening comments. And Viridiana, shifting it over to you and your opening comments, you're coming to us from Ras Al Khaimah, which is known for its mining and minerals industry. The emirate has reserves of limestone, of marble, of clay, and even small deposits of gold and silver. Limestone in particular is used for construction and for making cement, concrete, asphalt. What do you see as the conversations that are happening right now in the Ras Al Khaimah Municipality Department when it comes to circularity and when it comes to these particular minerals that it so abundantly possesses?
Well, I think that it is very important to change the mindset how we are doing this extraction of the products, because in other words, mining will require optimization of the design operations. That means that we have to focus in 3 points. That the first one is prioritize the renewable inputs, how we are producing, how we are extract them, the amount of energy that we are consuming to do that. And the second is to maximize the product use in the consumption. So how we are consuming to reduce the consumption also. And third, to close the circularity, we need to recovering byproducts and waste. And that means that we have to change the mindset how we perceive a waste. So we try to encourage the analysis through all the value chain, because we need to have this mindset of function and product-based sustainability that we'll need to replace with a more holistic approach. With organizational thinking, we have to measure across the entire value chain and considering all stages of the product life cycle, so we can reduce the energy that we are consuming, and also to help the industry to have these incentives to change, because now we are extracting the materials, but it's just a linear basis, and we have to include them to develop this circular economy that where the design, we have to analyze the amount of energy, and that is the issue now. So we are encouraged the industry to make this analysis through all the first stage to know the quantity of energy, and then try to reduce and make a plan for to achieve the net zero goals. So we are doing that.
Thank you. It's absolutely, it sounds like a multifaceted process. Dr. Kabemba, going off of Iridiana's comments and this layout for involving circularity in a strategic way, how much of circularity in the mining sector do you see as depending on downstream and upstream participants in the value chain? I mean, is circularity something that can only be achieved, in your opinion, in Africa with a comprehensive look at the value chain that extends beyond a particular company?
Thomas, thank you very much. But I think we need to start by saying that there is an agreement, almost a consensus, that circular economy will be a solution to multiple challenges that we are facing, including strengthening our resilience to climate change goals. And the mining sector is a high impact potential on environment, on social and economic and corporate governance. And the extraction of minerals both use a lot of energy through the value chain, both downstream and upstream. And mining is always an activity that is important for the global economy, but mining needs to also be controlled so that it does not impact negatively on the biodiversity, environment, and climate change. So there must be strong regulations from government to regulate companies' activities to ensure that they reduce, they decarbonize their activities across the value chain, but also they recycle a number of material that come out of mining, including water that is one of the biggest problem we have in the mining sector, that water, most of the time in Africa, water is polluted and communities adjacent to this mining cannot use it. There are technologies that needs to be introduced to ensure that mining companies, as they decarbonize their activities, they are also recycle some of the reject in the environment, including pollution of water and the impact on land. The tailing dam has become a much biggest issue. Is how do we ensure that we bring back nature as it was before mining, and that will require investment by mining companies. I think they have sufficient resources to do that, but it also require government policies, but also companies' policies internally, but also strong monitoring system and a regime of sanctions for companies that do not abide by that. On downstream, downstream, but there's also stakeholders who provide services to these companies, and we need also to ensure that service providers to mining companies also are educated and are introduced to regime that respect environmental and climate change regulations, but also to avail technology to them to be able to ensure that they limit their emission, but also they introduce technology that can recycle some of the material that comes off. But mining is not just on extraction, but it goes further on manufacturing, and that is it's very downstream. And when they speak about batteries manufacturing in Africa, we are trying to push for that. But I think we need to put our regulation in place, and we need to have technology that will allow us that we don't, that manufacturing of batteries coming from critical minerals does not further undermine our diversity and environmental pollution.
Right. And you mentioned the government several times, and you know, on this theme of government, Akshay, I'll throw this one at you. When it comes to sustainability, some sectors end up being put under the microscope a lot more than others, and the big one recently that's been under the microscope is the energy sector and this balance between energy transition and energy security, especially in 2022. But what about the mining sector? When it comes to the mining sector, the mining industry, do you think that it's facing the same pressures to incorporate circularity and to become more sustainable as other sectors like energy? And if so, from who and in what ways? From the government or otherwise? And if not, why not? How has the sector managed to stay under the radar?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the sector being critical to biodiversity. I mean, I think biodiversity is an order of magnitude more significant in the short term than climate change. I think the language that we're going to be exposed to in the media is going to be a step shift from high carbon concerns to high metal concerns. We are shifting from a high carbon economy to a high metals economy. Everything that's required for new energy involves utilization of metals, and I don't think the public opinion has yet got to grips with that. There are some markets like which are where metals are produced, which are coming to terms with that and are recognizing that the minerals that they have, for example, Zimbabwe is a significant producer of lithium and has recently banned the export of non-processed lithium. Now, part of that is to ensure that there is local beneficiation. There is a bit of leverage on the part of the government to be able to force beneficiation to occur in country, which will have social benefits in terms of employment and the creation of manufacturing. But to your point, lithium's perhaps not the best example because it's plentiful, it's everywhere. This will be more acute when we speak to metals like cobalt, which are located in very few locations, DRC, Finland to a lesser degree. And the real issue is it was quite simple to communicate to public opinion how to reduce energy usage. It was always measured in tons of CO2. There is no metric to measure planet positivity or circular friendly or environmental friendly. There are very few metrics because the concepts are more complex. You know, the impact on the local environment, the impact on pollution, the impact on biodiversity in terms of species destruction. It can't be stuck into one simple measure like tons of carbon. And so that creates challenges in itself, because the building blocks of regulation are those metrics. And we may find that, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, that we speak of a grading system which is a bit more textured. And that will then form the building blocks to essentially create regulation which will influence the behavior of miners. I think, personally speaking, that miners are probably going to have some degree of delegated responsibility to manage the problem, you know, from themselves upstream all the way to the downstream processes, as I mentioned earlier on. So they have an incentive to collaborate with regulators, with NGOs, with third parties to develop those very metrics so that we can achieve you know, similar results that we've seen in relation to net zero and carbon usage.
Absolutely. And Dr. Kabemba, using Zimbabwe as a sort of case study where just last month, like Akshay said, they banned the export of raw lithium because they say that they're losing out on billions of dollars in mineral proceeds to foreign companies, and that hampers their economic development. And if they are to proceed with this strategy of processing lithium in country, there's a unique opportunity for them to build that up in a way that incorporates circularity. How do you see that happening? What is the next step that Zimbabwe or similar countries could take in order to make their operations more economically circular?
I think Zimbabwe, first of all, we need to say that is a great approach to ensuring that Zimbabwe maximize benefits from its minerals, and specifically currently that climate change has provided opportunity for African government to maximize benefits by adding value to these critical minerals. But I think policy and the regulations, the government must start by putting in place policy and the regulation that see waste as a resource. Mining, that processing will produce a lot of waste. One of the policy we need to recognize is that there is need to have laws and the regulation on how then the waste will be processed. And it's a very detailed work that the government of Zimbabwe must do. The regulation will have to focus on the entire value chain, from production of waste, its capturing, its transformation into resources, and its reuse. And that way, unless we have a clear policy that have been produced with the engagement of all stakeholders, including communities, government, private sector, and manufacturers, we might have a problem where we put up a big infrastructure to process these minerals, but at the end, they create more problem for our environment. So, and in fact, we are working on the GRI guidelines, disclosure. So mining companies will have to disclose, including manufacturers, because mining companies are not in the business of transforming minerals into something else. So Zimbabwe will have to bring in investors that are specialized in the work of manufacturing. So from both mining companies and the manufacturers, there must be a process of a clear list of information on what is the waste produced during extraction of these minerals and their consequences, the impact if they are not recycled. But that same process will have to take place at the manufacturing place. They have to come with a clear list of waste that is produced and how they intend to recycle it and the technology that is going to be used. So the organization can assess and report itself. There must be a reporting system for the mining companies and for the manufacturers on their input activities, output led, or could lead to, and how this waste could lead to impact, to serious impact on the environment.
And Viridiana, going off of that, Dr. Kabemba is saying that government plays a critical role. There have to be established frameworks and standards through which companies operate, and these frameworks have to comprehensively look at the full value chain. From the point of view of your experience at Ras Al Khaimah and the municipality department, can you give us a few insights into best practices or what has helped Ras Al Khaimah in its quest to join sustainability with mineral production?
Well, I think that something that is required is to have a vision. So when you have a vision to lead the industry to reduce the energy consumption, you make these policies and frameworks to help the industry to develop a strategy to reduce the energy consumption. That is doing Ras Al Khaimah. We have this strategy to reduce the energy consumption for 2040. So we provide assessments, and now we have this initiative that is called Industrial Energy Advisory. So we provide the assistance with auditors. We make these partnerships. So we made a strategy plan. We help them to understand what is the goal. So we make a roadmap. So we connect the two frameworks. We provide with different policies how we can help them to incentivize that we have these programs to reduce energy consumption, and it's important because they get involved. And also we have to provide the right partnership to them to develop this strategy. So for example, we have the ENGIE, and they provide assistance how to reduce the waste energy. And with that, we can start to do this strategy to reduce it. I think that is one of the key parts, is that we have to provide the right framework so the industrial can understand and make awareness why we are doing this, because they have to be aware of why we are doing, because if they are not interested, if they don't have any benefit, because sometimes we have the solutions that, but we don't have the right understanding what is happening. So I think that if we don't have the right vision, we cannot create it. And that is the reason when we have a plan, we can work together with industrial, make this follow up and implementing all these plans. So we work together. So we need this work between the government, between the industry, and also with the private sector.
Right. So it sounds like an iterative, collaborative process between various sectors. And actually, to that point, specifically with circularity and mining in Africa, there are, it sounds like, an array of concerns, from lack of infrastructure to limited funding to the complexity of the mining sector by its very nature that has so many interdependencies, in addition to potential implications for biodiversity, and not to mention that mining is by its nature, again, very energy intensive. What do you see as the major hurdles for circularity in mining in Africa?
Well, I think that you make a very, very good point there. I mean, mining in Africa has always been complex from an economical, a social, a governance perspective, because of the history of mining and pit-to-port mines and infrastructure. Go back to the colonial regimes, which originally created a lot of that infrastructure, and the suspicions around it in terms of how mining operates is always an ever-present concern in African societies. To the extent that in the last boom, large-scale miners were solicited for social programs to ensure that hospitals and schools were built, to ensure that a lot of the social infrastructure that's usually the domain of government is built, because there is a collective sense that there is a debt owed by that industry to those markets. Now, that's fully understood. I think the bigger concern, and probably the elephant in the room in terms of exploitation of natural resources, is the role of the consumer. And ultimately, as I referred to earlier, there's going to be probably a step change, probably driven by the price, actually, of use of virgin materials, because as projects become more circular, it's quite possible they become more expensive. And it's quite possible that the price of virgin materials will diverge potentially from the price of non-use of virgin materials. So there is a role, if you like, for the consumer to recognize that actually there is a change in culture that's required in terms of usage of products and equipment, which will likely filter into the demand for large-scale mines. And we might find that the future may involve much smaller scale mines, which are more easily capable of creating the conditions for circularity. And that's what I envisage in the future. And we're already seeing that in terms of funding, which is available for very large scale mines. It's more complex than it is for much smaller scale installations.
And I was going to say, we just have a few minutes left for the podcast, and as we start thinking about closing comments, the final question I'd like to ask all three of you is that even as we think through this paradigm shift of usage for minerals, metals and minerals in particular in some ways seem well suited for circularity. They can potentially be infinitely recyclable. They have their high value acts as an incentive for businesses to reuse and recycle as much as possible. As we think about closing comments, Viridiana, we can start with you. What do you see as potentially low-hanging fruit and easy next steps for further incorporating circularity into metal and mining sectors?
We need to implement more digital technologies to measure everything around all this supply chain value. Because when we have this digitalization and transformation in the supply chain, we can measure and optimize. So this digital solution will be something that will help to reduce the amount of energy that we need to reduce in all the manufacturing and also for the production and extraction of the metals, because the metals is also a key for the energy transition. So it will be something critical, because according to the International Energy Agency, we need to develop more green procurement and green energy metals to achieve the energy transition. So we need the help of the digitalization to close the loop and also invest in new technologies and replace sometimes some of the equipments to achieve the circular economy. That is my view.
Thank you. And Dr. Kabemba, we'll go to you next. Closing comments and easy next steps, low-hanging fruit for continuing down the path of circularity.
Thomas, I think there is a bigger question we want to ask. We are seeing a rush for extraction of these critical minerals. And the question is it possible on the one hand to increase extraction, on the other hand to speak about a circular economy? The circular economy champions zero discharge. Considering the high level of environmental, social impact, it seems to me justifiable to consider the circular economy in the context of mineral extraction. The question is it possible? If it is, what should be done? And I'm raising this question, Thomas, because the manner in which the circular economy is conceptualized today, it protects more the consumer of the minerals than the producer. It's the Africa versus the West, China, whatever who's producing. Mining activities is continuing today to pollute water, land, air, tailing dams, biodiversity, affect the health of millions of people. It seems logical, I think, Thomas, beyond the circular economy, it seems it's not different from the sustainability paradigms. The circular economy does not plan to disrupt the power relations in the way the mineral resources are extracted and the benefits are shared. I think for me, the hanging fruit is how through this conceptualization of the circular economy, we bring justice, where mining communities who bear the brand of negative impact of mining could then have their voice heard. And their voice is always been, how do we maximize benefits? Can you conceptualize circular economy in a manner that starts to ensure that justice is brought back in the value chain in terms of benefits, in terms of impact? So in the last, I think my conclusion is really to say the demand from thousands of communities that suffer without benefiting will not see circular economy as a solution. in the mining sector if their lives, their conditions are not changed.
Great, and Akshay, we'll give you the last word. So, closing thoughts on easy next steps
Yeah.
for circularity. We've heard digitalization. We've heard a potential rethinking of what it even means for circularity to be compatible with the mining sector, and reminding ourselves of the social justice element to it. We welcome your closing thoughts on the topic.
Well, I just want to reflect on what Claude just said there. Ultimately, this is all going to be driven by what we consider to be positive for the environment, for biodiversity, for planet positivity, to coin a phrase. That metric is going to drive how we develop regulation. And that metric, it's incumbent on all of us to participate in a process to determine and evaluate what that metric is, because that will drive the social benefits to local communities. It will drive the environmental benefits. It will drive how we recycle. It will drive pretty much everything. And I think, going back to the elephant in the room, I think circularity, as Claude also mentioned, is a byword for sustainability. And we really need to move to a society in which we evaluate why we use virgin resources for certain things and how we can favor the use of recycled materials for certain things. And I suspect in the long run, we're going to see a switch from virgin materials to recycled materials. And that may have a radical change in our culture because it will increase the cost of goods that we use on a regular basis. And that radical change, I suspect, will drive and will determine where we end up.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all to all the panelists. Our half hour together can be incorporated into the mining and minerals sectors. We heard some questions, we've heard some answers, and we will continue to get answers as the series progresses. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, Akshay Fofaria, Dr. Claude Kabemba, and Viridiana Belowitle. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us again in the future.